I'm Ron Lichty, and I'm here to talk to you about becoming a first-time manager or being a first-time manager. I have what I don't think is actually terribly unique experience in the fact that I've been a first-time manager 3 times, or maybe a first-time manager, a second-time manager, a third-time manager. I've had 3 transitions to management from programming. I began my career as a programmer, and I should start there. I began my career as a programmer, and I was a pretty good programmer. I wrote compiler code generators. I wrote compiler code cross compiler generators. I wrote multimedia applications. I've got several patents actually in microcontroller device software that was at a time that in order to get a patent on software, it had to be connected with hardware. I thought I had the best job in the whole world. But after 7 years of coding, I thought, I'm curious about this managing thing. And I was in a 2-person company, and in a 2-person company, you don't get to manage. And it occurred to me, well, I got an offer to come manage at a very large company that was the only company that I was truly interested in. And that company was Apple Computer. Apple made me an offer to come manage a product management group, actually, in development tools. I managed that group for 1.5 years. I learned a ton, but I wasn't yet convinced that I wanted to stick to managing. And during one of Apple's many reorgs, I went back to programming. They made me a manager. 6 months later, during yet another reorg, I went back to programming. They made me a manager again. The thing that caused me to go back and forth was I really loved programming. I really loved the ecstasy of solving hard programming problems. At the same time, I continued to be curious about and continued to feel additional gratification and additional value that I was delivering, enabling teams. And that was ultimately what made the transition for me stick the 3rd time, was the realization that while I was giving up the ecstasy of solving problems myself, I was creating an environment in which teams of programmers could thrive. That's the course. That's been the course of my career. I went from being a manager to I left Apple for my first director of engineering role at Berkeley Systems and screensavers and games and flying toasters and fish. I then went on to do entertainment software, the Worlds Away software, online animated virtual worlds that were done inside of a very large company, Fujitsu. Went on from there to do entertainment software, from there to do financial services software at Charles Schwab. Got promoted to be a VP of engineering at Schwab and continued to lead engineering organizations through all of these companies. 2012, so that was about 9 years ago, I pivoted my career one more time to do consulting. I realized that the part of managing that I had enjoyed the most was, in fact, transforming chaos to clarity. It was coming into an organization that was struggling or that was not firing on all cylinders and getting that organization to truly hum. And so for the past 9 years, I have parachuted into organizations as an interim VP of engineering to help organizations hum and to find their long-term engineering leader. I have assessed organizations on behalf of VPs of engineering and CTOs and CEOs. I have trained teams in Agile, and I've trained executive teams in Agile to understand how they can support their teams that are using Agile. And I have coached a handful of engineering leaders, primarily VPs of engineering and CTOs. Mickey Mantle and I, this is my 5th book. It was my first collaboration with Mickey, and the 2 of us together spent 8 years writing Managing the Unmanageable at a time when there were very few books on managing software people and teams. There's still very few books. There are about twice as many as there were then, and there's still very few books. We went into Addison Wesley to our publisher Pearson's studios and spent an entire week recording our book as video training, live lessons managing software, people, and teams. At the end of this talk, I'll give you discount codes for both of these, for the book and for the video lessons. So be prepared to take a screenshot at the end of the talk. I'm also the co-author of the Study of Product Team Performance. Some of you actually may have been part of one of our surveys. We've had 7 studies now, I believe, in which we ask people on product teams all over the world to characterize their teams. Are they high performance or low performance or something in between? And then we ask about practices, and we have learned some very interesting things about practices that high performance teams do that low performance teams don't. My consulting practice, and I want to share this with you, one of the things that I realized as I began consulting, I looked back over all of the full-time management roles that I'd had and realized that for the most part, that it was rare that people were the problem. In fact, every company I've worked at and every client I've had as a consultant, they've all been unique. But the problems tend to fall into categories. And as I said, not people, but they tend to fall into categories of process, of culture, of communication, of planning, and of rigor. Those are 5 areas that you and I, engineering managers, can help to solve. So I want to give you a sampling of what good management is and what that transition to management looks like. So what is a good manager? So I've asked actually audiences of developers and of engineering managers, actually all over the world. I've asked audiences to tell me what they consider a good manager to be. And so let me give you the results from just one of those. So here's a list of the characteristics that one audience gave me when I asked the question, what is a good manager? Now, I want you to look down this list and notice that there are only 2 bullets on this list that are technical. Now, I'm pretty sure that all programmers expect to have a manager who is technical. But what characterizes a good manager or a great manager? It's not the technical. It's not programming. It's not continuing to program. In fact, the 2 that I see here that seem like they've got a technical capability, one is being a domain expert, and one is being a visionary. And that visionary is oftentimes, sometimes it's on the product side, but more often it's on the engineering side. Where do we need to go? Where do we need to take our technology? What is that going to be about? Those 2 have some element of technicalness in them. The rest of these are all people skills. The rest of these are all process skills. The rest of these are all relating to our team's skills. So let's start there. And let me move on to this anti-pattern, what I believe is an anti-pattern for managers, which is attempting to both code and manage. And I'll say a couple of things about attempting to both code and manage. We are likely, if we attempt to both code and manage, to do one of these things well, not both of them. And furthermore, the one we're going to tend to do well is probably the one where our comfort zone is. And our comfort zone is, for me, I had spent 8 years programming. And falling back into programming was by far the easiest thing. And so when I began managing, I attempted to not code, and absolutely, so, do some hobby coding, do some coding of some things that are not part of production, but don't put yourself on the line for software delivery, for the software delivery that your team has to do. I think it's a real anti-pattern for managers. And then I want to share with you this rule of thumb for climbing the career ladder, which is also true when going from being a manager to a director and director to a VP. And that is, but it really is obvious when going from being a programmer to being a manager. And that rule of thumb is that the very thing that has made you successful at one level will get in your way in your next role. And it was clear to me, looking back on it, the thing that made me successful as a programmer was being able to shut out the world. The thing that made me successful as a programmer was being able to climb into the microprocessor and listen to its gates open and close. It was becoming one with my code. The thing that made the thing that I needed to do to be successful as a manager was not only put a welcome mat out in front of my door, but to actively invite interruptions. The very thing that I had learned to block out as a programmer, I needed now to invite, because my team's concerns, my peers' concerns, and my manager's concerns were my concerns on behalf of my entire team. So let's break that down a little bit. Success as a programmer, highly honed coding skill, the ability to focus, the ability to block out distractions. Success as a manager, on the other hand, welcoming interruptions, focusing on enabling others, delegating work to members of your team that you know you could do better than they can. At least as a first-time manager, that's probably true. People skills, coaching skills, and empathy. Most of that long list that I showed you, that audience gave me about their best managers. And then I want to note that success as a manager, we have too few role models. My role models had 201. My role models had been two ends of the scale. One, micromanagers, and the other, throw people in the deep end and watch them sink or swim. Those are not good role models for managers. Good role models for managers are delegators. People who delegate work and then support the individuals and the teams to get their work done. And then finally, success as a manager requires us to do dramatically more managing up and managing out than we've ever done before. And so that's a huge change for us as transitioning to management. So all of that comes back to this rule of thumb for climbing the career ladder. The very thing that's made you successful in your last role will get in your way in your next role. So let me share another rule of thumb, which is around delegation. Trust but verify. This is a rule of thumb that Mickey and I have both used. And trust but verify actually has a source. Some of you may recognize it. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. What you probably don't realize was that Ronald Reagan was quoting Vladimir Lenin, and Vladimir Lenin was in fact espousing a proverb, a Russian proverb, when he said trust but verify. The thing with trust but verify is that it embodies the imperative not to micromanage. It embodies delegation. It is the essence of delegation. It talks about setting expected outcomes for teams and about verifying that we're getting it. And so here's a second rule of thumb from Alan Lefkoff, who at the time I heard him say it, was the CEO of Natopia. Alan later told me he learned this rule of thumb: I inspect what I expect, that he learned that from Lou Gerstner, who later became the CEO of IBM. The two of them were both McKesson, they're both McKinsey consultants at the time that Alan Lefkoff learned this from Lou Gerstner. I inspect what I expect. Become a great manager, we need to be fair, we need fairness, and we need to be ethical and forthright and honest. A couple of rules of thumb around that. This one, leading by example occurs whether you like it or not. And another parallel one from Albert Schweitzer: example is not the most important way of influencing other people, it's the only way of influencing other people. And I like this one from Tim Swihart, this nugget of wisdom. All of these are in our book, by the way. We have a whole center section of rules of thumb that we have leveraged in our own work. Here's Tim saying, nothing undermines your credibility as a manager more completely than pounding on your team all year to get their work done on time and then telling them you don't have their reviews done because you were busy. Whatever you were busy with likely wasn't managing your people, so you've just proven to them that they don't matter. Good luck motivating them next year. Next, we need to facilitate communication. So one of my personal rules of thumb is that software development is a team sport. It has become my overarching rule of thumb as I've grown in management. Software development is a team sport, and team sports are gated by communication and collaboration. We need to facilitate communication. We need to communicate more, both within our teams and with the partners that we have in product management and marketing and sales. We need to communicate at every level, up, down, and sideways. Kimberly Weefling, one of my colleagues in the Silicon Valley engineering leadership community, Kimberly said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in this ratio. She was not stating a new idea. I went charging down this one and discovered that this was said in Greek, not exactly the same words, but the idea was expressed in Greek 5,000 years ago. We can trace this statement back that far. And if we are truly communicating that way, where we're listening more than we're speaking, then I don't think we can over communicate. I don't think we in software development can over communicate. I think it might be possible that people in sales can over communicate. I think it might be possible that people in marketing can over communicate. I don't think we in software development can over communicate. I'm going to share with you this. Mickey and I found 3 thought leaders in motivation that we share, just a couple of pages of each. I'm going to share another one of them later. One of them, actually, you'll recognize Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Almost all of us ran across Maslow's hierarchy of needs somewhere along the way. This guy is Douglas McGregor, and Douglas McGregor and actually all 3 of them came from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. McGregor said that to become a good manager, we need to switch from the traditional management approach that he called Theory X management, which was telling people what to do, being directive, being authoritarian. He used the word repressive as that style of management that came from the Industrial Revolution, or maybe even before that. And we need to switch in thought leadership. We need to switch to what he called Theory Y management, where managers are supporting their teams. Our goal is to hold up our team. And McGregor, interestingly, used the words enabling and empowering and developmental and continuous improvement, which are the very words that Agile uses when it calls out the role for us as managers in Agile as servant leaders. Next, I want to address the idea that programmers are not all alike. Programmers, we can't manage the individuals on our teams in the same way. We need to uniquely manage each of the individuals on our team, or uniquely lead the individuals on our team. Our programmers differ by programming disciplines. And if you've thought about the difference between database developers and systems engineers and web developers, you know how true that is. They differ by generations. Baby boomers versus Generation X versus Generation Y. Morning people versus night people. And we see the transition from night people to morning people when some of the people on our team start having babies and start raising kids. Employees versus contractors manage in very different ways. Proximity, are people close to us? Are people in our time zone? Do we get to meet with people, or or do we have to manage from a distance? Cowboys versus farmers. Cowboys who go off on their own and disappear into the night to only come back with code when it's finished versus farmers who plow their fields and are continually refactoring their code and making it better and making the software base better for everyone. All of these require different thinking about managing, and each one of them, each individual on your team will have differences of these and others of the characteristics that we call out in our book and talk about managing. We need to, as managers, enable and build psychological safety on our teams. Now, this is an interesting one because the word psychological safety really didn't enter. It had been around as a term for a long time, but it really didn't enter our parlance in software development until about 5 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. So here's a definition from the Harvard professor who studies psychological safety, Amy Edmondson, who said psychological safety is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. There's Amy Edmondson has written several books on teams and teaming and the Fearless Organization and other books. And she points out that anyone's voice at any time can be mission critical. So we need to make sure that everyone can step up. Everyone can bring their experience and expertise to the table without fear of taking that risk of sharing what they know. And this is particularly tough in software development circles because we tend to be introverts. The reason that psychological safety has come into our parlance in the last 5 years was Google. Google, just like the rest of us, has high performance teams and low performance teams and teams in between. Google, unlike all the rest of us, has a ton of money, and Google spends that money studying everything. And one of the things they thought they'd study was, well, let's study our teams and see why we have high performance teams and low performance teams and teams that are in between. And so they set up the Aristotle team to do the Aristotle study, to study all of their teams and figure this out. The Aristotle team went into this believing that they were going to find some kind of magical team makeup, that high performance teams would have, a 10x programmer, one of those mythical programmers who is 10 times as proficient as everybody else. Or maybe it would be all 10x programmers, or maybe it would be some different mix of 10x programmers, or maybe it would be diversity, or maybe it would be lack of diversity, or maybe it would be, they thought it would be team makeup. They found that team makeup had nothing to do with their high performance teams. Instead, the thing that made their high performance teams stand out was psychological safety. They called out two characteristics. They said mutual respect encourages sharing from everyone on our high performance teams. And they said that psychological safety provides their teams with the opportunity and the safety to speak up. And then they said something for me, truly magical. They shared, I think it's 7 words, that describe that. They say we can see psychological safety. You can walk into any of their high performance teams and you can see psychological safety because in those teams there is equality in distribution of conversational turn taking. There is no one who dominates the conversation. There is no one who's silent. There is equality in distribution of conversational turn taking. Amy Edmondson said it's not enough to just build psychological safety. We also have to set high standards. And she shared a quadrant. She looking at low versus high psychological safety, looking at low standards versus high standards, and said, if we've got to just have high psychological safety, our teams are just going to sit there in the comfort zone and be comfortable. What we want is our teams to be in the learning and high performance zone. And to do that, we need to both set high psychological safety and to also set high standards. One of the learnings for me as a manager, and I was probably 4 or 5 years into management when I discovered this, is that things that motivate are not the same as the things that demotivate. That just as we need to actively motivate, we also need to actively block out those things that would demotivate the individuals on our teams and our teams together. The thought leader in that was one of those. So I said that Mickey and I examined a couple of pages each, Maslow and McGregor, and Hertzberg was the third of those. Frederick Hertzberg basically said there are things that motivate there, but there are also things that demotivate, and you've got to eliminate the things that demotivate, or any attempts to motivate will go kaput. So we've got a number of charts in our books. This is a modification of Hertzberg's charts from the 1950s that Mickey and I did, based on what we believe motivate. The blue bars are what motivate programmers. The red bars what demotivate programmers. Programmers are more motivated by making a difference in the world. Most of us got into engineering because we wanted to make a difference in the world. We wanted to make an impact, sometimes on our spouses or our kids or our girlfriends or our boyfriends or our colleagues, or we wanted that big impact on the world. And then there's learning and growing and toys and technology and recognition and praise. These are all motivators, but they're useless to try to motivate if the demotivators are there. And notice the number one red bar there is respect for supervisors. So these are think of them in reverse. If people don't have respect for their supervisor, they're demotivated. If they don't have ethical management, they're demotivated. If the company policies and administration suck, they're demotivated. So nobody, I've never met anyone who said, oh yeah, I went to work for that company because of its company policies and administration. But I have found people who've left companies because of company policy and administration. So we need to pay attention to both motivators and demotivators. Then we really need to stay focused on what's important, and that's delighting customers. Here's Joe Kleinschmidt, who was a CTO in San Francisco and now a CEO there, who said in the beginning, everybody's going to talk about scope and budget and schedule, and you're going to have a bunch of people who are pounding on you for those things. But in the end, that's not what matters. What matters is people will love our software or they won't. And that's the criteria, the only criteria that we should truly manage to, because that's what keeps us in business. That's what keeps our companies in business, is people loving our software. So we have to be careful about what we reward. And this is a new idea as we become managers as well, because we haven't been we've only been rewarding ourselves as programmers. Now we're rewarding our teams. Jim Highsmith, one of the early agilists, said behavior revolves around what you measure. If you reward heroes, why would anyone be a farmer? Why would anyone spend their time building software day after day after day, week after week after week, if the person who gets rewarded is the person who comes in at the very end to save the day? We need to form some kind of balance between rewarding the day-to-day work and some amount of rewarding for the heroes, so that if we need someone to be a hero, they'll step up, but we never need to ask them to do that. Here's a rule of thumb that is, I think, a really important one. So I was sharing to never, ever, ever share velocity outside of the team. Velocity being an agile concept, maybe a Scrum concept, that allows teams to be predictable against their backlogs. But if it gets shared outside the team and the team begins realizing that if velocity is being measured, or they're being measured against some other team's velocity, suddenly their velocity will go up, but their outcomes and their output won't. Their output will stay the same, their outcomes will stay the same, but their velocity will go up. All of us know how to make velocity go up. We just have to give higher point values to all of our stories, and we can make our velocity go up. What gets measured gets manipulated. And at the point at which velocity goes up and outcomes and output don't, we no longer have a measure that we can use for predictability either. We have destroyed ourselves. If we define done as coding complete and not done as features that delight customers, we have missed the boat. Going back to that rule of thumb from Joe Kleinschmidt, we need our sole focus to be on making software that make our customers happy. And finally, in the motivating category, be very careful trying to reward with cash. So unexpected spot bonuses, great. But to say, oh yeah, so I'll give you more money if you meet this date, I'll give you more money. Suddenly people are working for money. If you want to dig into this one, Daniel Pink has written a terrific book called Drive that truly puts the kibosh to rewarding with cash. Then we as managers must foster culture. And I think that when I say that, I'm meaning a bunch of different things. One, we need to trust our people. We need to trust our people implicitly and form those bonds of trust with the folks who work for us. We need to empower self-organization and excellence. Our job is not to tell people what to do. Our job is to motivate them to want to figure out what's going to delight customers and do it. We need to expect and enable truly shared leadership. And to do that, we need to build psychological safety and set high standards. We need to model and defend and evangelize agile values. We need to foster a culture of communication. We need to encourage teamwork and collaboration because software development is a team sport. We need to shield our teams from the politics and the distractions that surround them, the torrent of politics and distractions that in most companies surround them. And we need to take care of stuff. We need to take care of our teams. In talking about establishing culture, this rule of thumb from Juanita Ma, who at the time was an engineering manager, she said, publicly reward or acknowledge engineers who act in a way that supports the culture that you want to create. I think that's a really useful way of thinking about rewards. And we need to learn to manage up. We need to manage our bosses much more than we ever did as programmers. Jim Kouzes said the single most important leader in an organization is your immediate supervisor. And Joe Folkman pointed out that you can safely assume that all perceptions are real, at least to those who own them. This is a hard thing to learn because we're now in the people management, people skills, people ability kind of space. And perceptions can differ. So we need to help our managers form the right perceptions of us and of our teams. Mickey and I, shortly after writing the first edition of our book, which came out 8 or 9 years ago, we were being interviewed together, and the interviewer, we've got 300 rules of thumb in the center section of our book. And the interviewer said, so what's the most important rule of thumb in your book? And both of us blurted out the same one: always be recruiting. In terms of building teams, in terms of building great teams, in terms of getting the right people onto our teams, it really is our most important job. We need to always be recruiting. We need to always be out there. We need to always be interacting with the world. We need to form relationships with candidates. We need to form relationships with candidates who we may not hire until 4 or 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now. But we want to build those relationships so that we can come back to that person at some future time. We want to maintain a relationship with the people who say no to our offers, because we may get the opportunity to make them an offer again. We, at the same time, and I think one of the reasons that that we get reluctance in the recruiting end of things is that sometimes we hire problem employees, and sometimes we inherit problem employees. So if it's not one thing, it's another. There's no perfect recruiting record, and even if there were, you'll inherit a problem employee. And so we need to learn some skills around handling problem employees, because our teams expect this. Our teams know if they've got a problem employee on their teams, they know, and they expect us to know, and they expect us to take care of it. Now, Marty Brownstein was my coach in dealing with my first truly problem employee. I'm going to recommend his book to you. Handling the Difficult Employee is a terrific approach to dealing with. It's a process that I'm going to call intervention, and it beats performance plans and firing hands down. It requires a ton of preparation, a ton of commitment, a ton of time, but it's focused on fixing issues earlier, turning employees around, or having them decide on their own that they're not a fit and leave. I want to talk about not bullying our way into management for the first time, and I think this is an anti-pattern that too many of us will have, and it's because we bowled our way through programming. Many of us have bowled our way through one programming language after another. How can I not just figure this out? And the fact is that the skill sets are so different that we really need to focus on learning management in order to be good managers. And so in becoming better managers, I want to talk to you about these 6 things. First of all, training. I lucked into my first management roles being at Apple Computer, which had a significant manager training program. Now, it didn't have anything that I can remember in the way of training us about managing the uniqueness of programmers, but it really did have good management programs. 3 that I benefited from. I started at Apple, and my boss said, "You will take Managers in the Law." Managers of the Law at the time was an Apple class taught by Apple's lawyers, and it was a half-day class. It's probably a 2-day class by now, but it was a half-day class, and it was shocking to me as a manager how much I really did need to know about the law and managing. And I came back from that class, I came back from that half-day in that class and thought, boy, if there's that much that I don't know about Managers in the Law, let me look at the rest of the catalog at Apple University and think about what else I should learn. That second class was situational leadership, which was where I learned that micromanaging and throwing people in the deep end and seeing if they're sink or swim are 2 ends of a scale, and there's a really sweet middle. And that sweet middle varies based on the individuals that we're managing. The amount of delegation, the amount of support, the amount of enabling that we need to do as managers is situational. And then I took a number of classes that I took after that had content that included reflective listening, the ability to not just talk. I mean, in high school, there are classes in speaking, but there are no classes in listening. And reflective listening is a way of giving the person who's talking to you confidence that they're being heard. And that's really important in forming relationships with your reports, with your peers, and with your boss. 4th, and I'm going to point out that what I pointed out earlier, that Mickey and I went into Addison Wesley Pearson's studios and recorded our book as manager training. And as I said, I'll give you a discount code for both the video and the book at the end of the talk, which we're nearing. So becoming better managers, well, there are books. Our book, that's the white cover, is the first edition of our book. The second edition, which came out a year and a half ago, has a black cover, and we added an entire chapter on what it means to manage in an agile organization. But see, our book is centered there on half a dozen other books there were only a couple more than what you're looking at books on managing software developers in the history of programming. There are very few books now today. What is this, 9 years later, there are probably twice as many books on managing, but there's still very few. There are so few that you can buy all of them and get value out of all of them. And I encourage you to do that. Books are a great way to learn how to become a better manager. Third is mentoring. Get mentoring from your boss, get mentoring from your peers. When you become a manager, get mentoring from your network. It's how Mickey and I came to write Managing the Unmanageable. Was I applied for a job that Mickey had. I was a director of engineering. Mickey was a VP of engineering, trying to hire another director. I interviewed with him. It was such a great conversation that I came back to him, and I took another job. I had 3 offers at that point. But I came back to him and said, could we have breakfast on, could we have a breakfast on this weekend or a coming weekend and continue the conversation we were having during that interview? It was so interesting. It was so fascinating. And he agreed. We had breakfast, and it began a series of breakfasts over the course of a decade. We were having breakfast talking about the challenges of managing software developers and software development. And I was getting mentoring, but we were essentially co-mentoring each other and sharing with each other rules of thumb that ultimately became the center section of our book. So ask other managers about the most important lessons that they learned, about the mistakes they made, about how they solved those problems, about the surprises of managing, both good and bad surprises, and about where they find their sources of strength and support. And ask your reports. Practice that reflective listening. Ask your reports what they want in a manager and what they wish they could change of you, of their team, of themselves. And then leverage meetups. So I co-chair the Silicon Valley Engineering Leadership Community. There's also a San Francisco Engineering Leadership Community. I co-chair the Managing Software Teams in Seattle meetup. There are agile leadership groups. Get that benefit of experienced leaders talking about their experiences and their learnings and their challenges and their solutions. And then leverage rules of thumb. So I'm going to share just a few more of the rules of thumb that are in our book. As I said, there are 300 there, and there are more on the website that support the book. David Vidra said pair programming during an interview, pair programming for half an hour will save everyone's time. Not only do we learn how that candidate programs, but we learn how we collaborate together, and software development is a team sport. Uncle Bob Martin, one of the co-authors of the Agile Manifesto, said that writing clean code is what you must do in order to call yourself a professional developer. Mickey and I have both used that with an occasional programmer on our teams who was reticent to refactor and clean up their code. And Fred Brooks Jr., who wrote The Mythical Man Month back in the 1970s, was the author of Brooks Law, who said adding manpower to a late software project will make it later. One of the values and rules of thumb is we can say to our management, hey, I didn't make this stuff up. We've known this for 45 years. As I said, we've got 300 rules of thumb and nuggets of wisdom in the book and more at the website listed there. So here's my contact information. You may want to take a screenshot of that. And here are those discount codes for our book. So remember, what you want to do as you transition to management is really focus on the management part. Don't think you can bull your way in. Expect you're going to have to learn a ton. Some of that learning is from your people. And I have to say my first reports when I started becoming a manager suffered through my becoming a manager. And the more learning you can get earlier, the better off you're going to be. If you've not gotten the message yet, I love the role I've grown into over the past 20 years managing the delivery of awesome products. It's been rewarding in ways that I could never have imagined. What I've been showing you in the past 40 minutes or so seems exciting to you. I hope you take that excitement to the next level and put some of it to use with your own projects and teams. I've enjoyed sharing some of what I've learned over the years and wish you the best of luck and hope that you can take something of this presentation with you.
Hello and welcome back. This is your panel here. Thank you, Ron, for putting together that interesting first-time manager presentation. And we have a few questions we thought of ahead of time, and people who aren't able to attend this video sent to me. And let me take a few moments here and ask you those. So one of the things you talked about was your team's psychological safety. Well, can you talk a little bit more about that, and how do you actually build psychological safety?
Yeah, I think it's let me start with a couple of a little bit more in depth. So Esther Derby, who is the co-author of Agile Retrospectives, making good teams great, explains that psychological safety does not mean that you feel comfortable all the time. Psychological safety is that you feel comfortable talking about what makes you feel uncomfortable. I think that's a helpful way to understand psychological safety. Amy Edmondson, who's that professor who I brought up from Harvard, and who has studied psychological safety inside and out, she cites 4 reasons why people don't speak up. They don't want to be seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. So what that means is that as leaders, we need to be vulnerable ourselves, and we need to share who we are in the way that will allow other people to share who they are. So to start with, as for us, as managers and as leaders, we need to admit when we're wrong. There's actually an agile practice called a failure bow, in which you admit your mistakes. So I'll admit not looking into the camera. So Peter's been coaching me for this session. I'm looking into the camera, and I look off and not looking into. So I'm gonna stand up and take a failure bow to all of you to whom I've not been looking into the camera at, and the way the agile practice works is that everyone then applauds the person taking the failure bow, and it's a way of being celebrated for having a failure, and also a way of cementing the fact that I want to do better. I want to do better. I the person taking the failure bow, and I think that can be helpful. We want to share with our reports our failures and our learnings. And I actually learned this being a parent with my kids when they moved into junior high and high school and began getting totally skeptical of their parents. And so those of you who don't have kids probably remember that period of being skeptical with your parents. One of the things, so telling them what to do at that point is a difficult way to get them to do things, but it can be helpful to say, to share with them the failures that you had as a kid, and the result of those things, and say, well, you could do it like I did, and this is what the results were. So sharing your failures can be a very useful way of giving examples, as well as sharing, creating an environment of psychological safety. Hey, I'm willing to be vulnerable here. I'm willing to tell you what I did wrong. And then there's something called the prime directive for retrospectives. So those of you, probably all of you, are doing Agile in some way or another. What that means is that probably all of you are doing retrospectives in some way or another. And the man who wrote about retrospectives before Agile, Norm I forget his last name, but look for retrospective, Google retrospective prime directive. And what you'll see there is a prime directive that some of us read at the beginning of our retrospectives, because it reminds us that if we knew when we started the sprint, or if we knew when we started the project what we know now, we wouldn't have made those mistakes. But we did make some mistakes along the way. And instead of blaming ourselves and blaming each other for those mistakes, we need to celebrate the learnings that came from those. And so all of these, whether it's admitting mistakes, or whether it's modeling curiosity, and modeling asking questions, and maybe even modeling asking dumb questions, admitting when we don't know something. So when somebody throws out an abbreviation or an acronym, asking though, what is that? And sometimes they're the most obvious things, but it's helpful to everyone else, because there's probably somebody else in the room who doesn't know what it is either. So all of those, and not blaming as well. So all of those are ways of creating psychological safety on our teams.
And that makes a lot of sense when you're the leader, the manager, sort of leading the team. Another follow-on question that we just got in the chat is it possible to build psychological safety when your supervisor, manager, or your organization doesn't really care about it?
So I think that all of us can contribute to building psychological safety from where we are. Now, there's one of the things we talk about in the book is creating. We've got a whole chapter on creating culture and creating a software development culture. And one of the things that we talk about is that it starts from understanding your corporate culture, your company culture. What is that company culture? And that starts from looking at what are the company's values and mission, and then is the company living up to its values and mission? So we know that Enron had. So those of you who remember Enron had wonderful values. The fact is that they operated at 180-degree difference from those values. But they had wonderful values. And one of the things we can do is we can leverage those values, and we can leverage those values whether we're the leaders or whether we're individual contributors, by saying, one of our values is fairness. One of our values is delivering value to our customers. One of our values is, and we can use that value as leverage to building the culture that we want, including building a culture of psychological safety.
And maybe a follow-on to this is, in your presentation, you talk about managing up or managing your manager. Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean to manage my manager?
Yeah, so there's a rule of thumb, and there's a rule of thumb, and I shared it during the presentation, that perception is reality. And the fact is that your manager's perception about you and about your team is reality. And managing your manager means managing the perception that your manager has of you and your team, and helping your manager to understand the value add that you have and the value add that your team has for the mission of the company. And so you're managing perception.
You're managing perception. Can you talk a little bit more? How do you manage perception?
PR. You explain the contribution that you're making. You explain the contribution your team is making. You make the connection, and we need to do this with the people who work for us as well. Make the connection between what's the company's mission, what's the difference that our company is making in the world, and what's the difference that each of the individuals on our team is making. And sometimes we need to mirror that back to our managers when we're managing up.
Ron, let me just jump in here for a second. The other thing you can do, it's important to do in managing up, is understand what kind of communications your manager wants. Giving them too much information or too little information, both of them are bad. So you have to figure out exactly what the right thing is, make sure you're giving them the right amount at the right times, That's an important ingredient in managing up.
Yeah, a great point, Mickey. I had a manager at Schwab, actually, who new manager. My métier is not phone calls. And every morning, about 6 o'clock in the morning, on her commute into San Francisco, she was leaving me a voicemail, a long voicemail, that and it took me a while, but that's the trigger. That's what we have to listen for, is what is our manager's mode of communication. And in this particular case, her mode of communication was leaving me voicemails, and mine needed to be leaving her voicemails back.
So maybe
I think it's also really important for us to understand what it is that our manager is being graded on, what it is that our manager is going to be rewarded for. We need to understand what their objectives are, and how what we do contribute to those objectives. And it's a very
Delivering a
different
project on time.
Yeah, yeah. For one, one of the there's a ton of objectives, and when we're programmers, it's pretty clear. We've got a bunch of programming to do to make that contribution. As managers, that becomes much less clear and much more nebulous.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about reflective listening. Does that maybe that's part of what you're getting to, is this reflective listening skill, and how is reflective listening any different than I'm just listening to you?
So Tammy, what I'm hearing you ask is, what's the difference between just listening and reflective listening? Is that the question?
That's the question. Have you just answered my question?
Yes.
Okay.
So reflective listening is listening actively, playing that back to the person you're talking to, getting them to give you validation that what you heard is what they said, and or correcting or giving you insight into what the real question was, or what the real statement was, or what the real comment was. And reflective listening, as I said, was part of a number of classes that I took at Apple and at Fujitsu and at Schwab, the three very large corporations that I worked for that had classes for managers. And reflective listening was something that my wife very much appreciated my having learned a little bit more of. I'm still not. I wish I were better at it still, but I'm way better than I used to be.
It feels like it could almost be a little stilted. Is that this reflective listening? Like, yeah, I just told you that. Why are you telling me it again? Do you find that that's the case, or this actually works in a more natural sense?
And so I find that people who are speaking to me when I'm being reflective are actually appreciative that I've either heard what it is that they're saying, or that I'm playing it back because it's not what it is that they were trying to get at. It's not the thing that was most important to them in saying what they said.
However, you can't do it all the time, or it would become annoying.
Yeah, that's true too.
Okay. One of the things you talk about, Ron, is an important criteria for a product is to ensure that people love your product. And as an engineering manager, I could think, well, that's interesting, but that's really not my job as the engineering manager. That's the job of the product manager who works with sales and all the other organizations, and they're the ones that really dial in and need to understand customer love and reflect it back to me. How can I, as an engineering manager, feel much ownership for my customer loving my product?
So I'm gonna contend, Tammy, that all of us in the product organization, developers, testers, UX designers, product managers, are responsible for customer delight. We're all responsible for quality of the product, and we're all responsible for customer delight. And our product, what we count on our product managers for, and I love product managers for the fact that I hope they have time, and they're spending a third or more of their time with customers, truly understanding customers and being able to say, well, what's going to delight them is this nuance or that way of creating the product or this way of designing the user interaction with us. And so UX designers and product managers essentially bring the customer, the proxies for customers. They bring customers into the room for all of us who are engineering managers and engineers and designers and testers, all of us to understand how we can make that spark of delight in our customers.
Okay. So I listen to your overall your overall presentation. You talk about all of the challenges that first-time managers have, particularly first-time managers have. I mean, there's so many things. What was successful before and made me successful before, it's going to be my downfall. I mean, it just seems perhaps a bit overwhelming. As a first-time manager, do you have any suggestions of this whole suite of skills I now need to develop? Where do I start? I can't do it all at once.
Yeah, so I think starting with the recognition that the job is different. It's a different job than I had as a programmer, and I need to I need to make some shifts, and I need to be curious about managing and about what good managing looks like as I was about programming. Secondly, thinking about the best managers that I've ever had and what parts of what they did I want to emulate. And what made them stand out. And I think if you get aligned, if you get synced into that, I think those two things can be really powerful. Mickey, do you want to add anything to that?
Just the converse of that, thinking about the worst managers you've had and what you don't want to be like. That motivated me more than anything. I had a guy who I said, I'm never going to be like him.
Yeah, actually, that's really true. My first manager was a micromanager, and I thought, no, I'm never going to be like him. And so I became a sink or swim manager for a while until I took that training at Apple and realized that there was a sweet spot of delegation and supporting that I really wanted to be. That was the sweet spot where I really wanted my management to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of my role models were the negative role models. I am never going to do what this person did to us or me or my team. We have an interesting comment from Clive here. He says, perhaps surprisingly, leadership training at military academy instills these people management skills. It also teaches how to switch it off and give orders when the plan abruptly changes. So it is common beyond just software development, management, and leadership skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a manager working for me when I was a director of engineering at Schwab, who had been in the Marine Corps. And my background is not military, but his background was military. And it was very interesting realizing that the military training and leadership that he had really aligned well with agile, not with command and control, not with telling people what to do, because in warfare, he explained to me, in warfare, when you go into battle, the team has to work together. The team has to have each other's backs. The team, every member of the team has to step up, and it's very much like the model for self-organizing agile teams.
So thank you for that. We're now going to switch gears just a bit. For those of you who are just joining us, we are wrapping up Ron Lichty's first time manager session, and we're going to switch now over to Mickey Mandels, who's going to do a session on managing remote software development. You can see here on the screen, there's myself, I'm your MC, Ron and Mickey, who have been answering questions. If you haven't had a chance to add questions to our live chat, please do that, and I'll ask them of our two speakers. Ron will stick around, so at the end of Mickey's sessions, if there's still some more questions for Ron, he'll be there to answer them. We have Peter in the background who's running all the controls, and we'll wrap this up at the end. And Joy, who's Peter just went behind the secret curtain again. Joy, who's doing our backup just in case our internet goes down, since we are broadcasting from the desert where the word reliable never goes with the word internet. So Mickey, a very brief introduction to Mickey, and he will give you a little more information in his talk. He's been developing software for 40 years. He started as a system programmer, moved to a tech lead, to a manager, to a VP of engineering, to a CTO, to a COO, to CEO. So a lot of that C-suite in there. And let's turn it over to Mickey's presentation, and we will be back live with you as soon as it's over.